Today's guest is zoologist Arik Kershenbaum, here to teach us about animal communication and what it may reveal about the curious mind, language, and life of humans. Through this, hopefully we can deepen our understanding and connection with each other, ourselves, and our animal friends. So let's give a big welcoming howl to Dr. Arik Kershenbaum. Today we're going to learn about why animals, including humans, communicate. But first, let's start really basic. What even is communication?
Well, there's this huge difference between communication and language. And the key thing to remember is that all animals communicate, all of them, every single one. It's just part of what it means to be an animal. Or what makes an animal, different from a plant, say, is that animals move around. Animals have to move around to look for food. And the moment you start moving around, you start getting far away from other animals of your species. So all animals have some need for communication to stay in touch, to find mates, if they live in societies, to keep in touch with other members of their society. So communication is universal amongst animals. Language is something a little bit more complicated, a little bit harder to define, but certainly communication we see everywhere.
Okay, like do plants don't move, so do plants communicate?
They do. And when I say that all animals communicate, that doesn't mean no one else does, but it means that all animals communicate. Oh, so communication from a scientific perspective or from a evolutionary biological perspective is a signal that one organism sends out that influences the behavior of another organism for their own benefit, for the benefit of the organism that makes the signal. So you can certainly see that using that definition, which is a really nice definition because it sort of explains the mechanism by which communication can evolve. But using that definition, sure, plants communicate. This is exactly what flowers are, right? Flowers attract pollinators, and that's to the advantage of the plant because that's how they get pollinated. But that signal, that visual signal, is a form of communication. It's influencing the behavior of the bees. So, certainly communication is very widespread.
Right, and then I guess animals come along and they start moving. So how does communication start changing once you get into the animal kingdom?
Well, there's two things. As I said, once you're moving, then you're more likely to be far away from whoever it is that you need to communicate with. But the other thing is, once you start moving and you have legs or fins or wings or whatever it is you use to move, you need a quite a complicated brain to control those, to make sure your legs or your wings move in unison. You probably need some sort of eyes to see where you're going. Otherwise, you'll start bumping into things. So animals have this nervous system. They have this brain primarily to control movement. But once you have a brain that's integrating all kinds of information from the outside world, including the signals of other animals, then you start getting complicated behaviors. Then communication really can develop into something quite subtle and quite sophisticated because of all of that processing ability that the animals already have in their bodies, if only to control movement.
Okay, so why do some animals communicate in one way and other animals communicate in other ways?
Well, communication in itself serves some kind of evolutionary purpose. So it won't exist unless there's an advantage to the animals for communicating. And that advantage varies so much between different kinds of animals. I mean, you've really got to look at the interactions between individuals and ask yourself, where's the advantage of communication? What is it these animals need? No one evolves complex communication just because it's kind of cool or because they want to be like humans or something like that. No, there's always an advantage. There's always some sort of evolutionary advantage. So if you are an animal that lives in a group, in a society, maybe there are lots of reasons that you might need to live in a large group. Wolves, for example, need to live in a large group so they can catch large prey. But once you live in a large group, you need to be able to communicate with other individuals in your group. You need to tell them what you're doing, what you need, what you want. So animals that live in groups tend to have very complex communication. Animals that live on their own, or mostly on their own, have much fewer need for communication, and so their communication tends to be simpler. But to each their own needs dictate what kind of communication they have.
Okay, so we're not really going to develop any more complex style or whatever method of communication than we need. We're just gonna like. There's no point in.
Yeah, I know what you're saying because it's a really common idea that somehow human language, human communication is really, really cool. And it is. I mean, it is cool and it is special. And what we do is pretty amazing. The fact that we're talking, across the other side of the world and conveying these really complex ideas, that is really amazing. But most animals don't need that. There's no advantage for them to have this kind of level of complexity of communication, and they don't evolve it just because it's cool. They only evolve this kind of communication if it actually serves their needs. So yeah, each animal evolves just as much communication as they need, no more.
How about the environment or the geography or the weather or lighting conditions, all of these kinds of things? How do these sort of things influence the way animals communicate or we communicate even?
So that's an interesting question with lots of different facets. So obviously, I mean, the sort of the obvious answer is, well, depending on your environment, that dictates what type of communication you have. If you live in a very noisy environment, don't use sound to communicate. If you live in opaque environment, I know underwater in a very sort of turbulent mud-filled stream, don't use light to communicate. So to some extent, the channel, the medium that you use to communicate is dictated by the environment around you. If you want to communicate long distances, also, you need some sort of signal that travels well long distances. So that's a sort of simple explanation. The slightly more complex explanation is that if you live in those environments, let's say that you are a fish living underwater in a very muddy sort of turbulent stream, then that environment dictates the kind of social structure you will have. Because to exploit that environment well, you may not need many other individuals that you need to talk to. So the environment affects the physical channel by which you communicate, but the environment also affects the kind of social structure that you have, which in turn affects the complexity of your communication.
Okay. Maybe let's get into some concrete examples. You studied wolves. That's one of the animals you've studied. There are many others, but maybe you could take us into the world of the wolves and the different ways that they communicate with each other, and maybe what that can teach us about human communication as well. If anything, I'm sure it'll teach us something about human communication.
Yeah, it does. I mean, all of these things are variations on a theme. Human communication is a variation on what animals do. Wolves are a really great example because obviously they live in packs. Why do they live in packs? Again, that's dictated by their niche. It's dictated by the kind of lifestyle they need to lead, particularly if they are hunting animals larger than themselves. They can't catch a moose. One wolf can't catch a moose all by itself, so they live in large packs. The moment you live in large packs, then there's a need for communication. Now, wolves happen to live in packs which are largely, not entirely, but largely a single family. So you'll typically have parents, young. Um, Obviously, when the young get old, they often leave. Some of them stay. Sometimes wolves from other packs join a pack just because it's useful to have lots of wolves in a pack. But by and large, the wolves in a pack are closely related. And that means that they have an evolutionary advantage to cooperating with each other. They really they can benefit from cooperating. So you have this social structure that is really quite harmonious. There's really very little fighting that goes on within a pack. They're all family essentially. And so a lot of the communication is around either what they need to do in terms of finding food or protecting their territory against other packs or finding each other. So remember, wolves travel long distances, so they could be miles away and they need to stay in touch with each other. Or the communication is about what they need. So pups need to be fed. Some animal might want to mate, might not want to mate. Those kind of signals that you need to convey to each other. And if you contrast that to a group of animals that are less related, chimpanzees, for instance. So in a chimpanzee troop, the animals are much less related to each other than in a wolf pack. There, the communication is much more about politics. It's much more about manipulation, much more about getting an advantage over others. Who do I ally myself with in a fight against other chimpanzees? And you see so the nature of that social structure really dictates the kind of communication that needs to go on in a group. And in wolves, it tends to be relatively sort of family based and relatively harmonious.
Humans fight, wolves don't so much. Is there anything we could learn from wolves, like the way they navigate that conflict, or is it just we're stuck with what we are and we're like chimpanzees and we're gonna fight? Is there how can we communicate in certain ways to decrease the fighting?
Well, humans evolved from ancestors who lived in very large groups with probably relatively low relatedness between the individuals. We don't really know much about our ancestors, but chances are, when we diverged from chimpanzees about 6 million years ago, our ancestors went down into the savannah and probably lived in relatively large groups, relatively large, relatively low relatedness. And that's probably what drove, or at least one of the things that drove the complexity in our communication. It is a part of who we are. We are used to living in relatively unrelated groups. And you don't need to look far to see that when you have a small village or a small family, things tend to be a lot more peaceful than when you have two countries facing off each other. So, to a large extent, it is part of the nature of who we are that we live in these large unrelated groups. That there is a lot of conflict, but it's problematic to draw too many direct comparisons like that. Because the other thing that is important to remember is that animals tend to act in an optimal way. Evolution is a really powerful force that favors those individuals that are effective, that can reproduce and have successful offspring. And over generation after generation, those things are really what count in determining animal behavior. An animal that manages well, that can cope well in one of these societies, has more offspring, and so those are the behaviors that propagate. Humans are not like that. We are subject to whims, ideas, fads, trends. Our language allows us to change our mind 100 times during a lifetime. You can be, a socialist one day and a capitalist the next. It is this lack of that long-term optimality, that selection for long-term optimality in humans means that it's very hard to compare human behavior to animal behavior.
Yeah, it's like it's such a big mystery. How the heck did we get these words and language? I don't think we can answer that question, but it's oh, man, it's wild.
And it's a controversial subject in the anthropological sciences. We don't really know how language evolved. There are many competing theories. One of the best, I think, ideas about where language really came from is that when our ancestors lived in these large groups and had these complex interactions and needed to manage with each other, the thing that really was necessary was an understanding of myself as an individual and you as a separate individual. And you aren't me. You know things that I don't, and I know things that you don't. Very few animals have that. Okay. Very, very few animals have that. Not none. There are, dolphins, elephants, chimpanzees. There are some that do. But it's actually quite a rare phenomenon in animal behavior. The moment you have this understanding that I know something you don't know, then communication takes on a whole new meaning. I might want you to know what I know because I know you don't know it. Or I may not want you to know that because I want to hide it and keep it to myself. So it's quite likely that language evolved after humans evolved this ability to understand, hey, I'm me and you're you, and we're not the same.
This is a podcast about brain health, and especially I'm trying to understand some of these people who are kind of on the extremes of of life, and oftentimes they're having problems with communication. They're alone. And that's sort of one area I want to get and go into. Like the wolves are sometimes alone, and the chimpanzees are sometimes alone, and some of these different animals are socially isolated, and they start calling out for connection. And yeah, how does the way that these alone animals communicate connect to the way we do it? You said that the complexity of language is tied to the complexity of the social structure. But what happens to the animals who aren't really part of that social structure? Does that mean their language kind of falls apart, or what do they do?
Well, the animals that need to live in groups, wolves, for instance, because that's the way that their lifestyle has evolved, um, are going to have a sense, an internal sense, an emotional sense that they need to be in a group, right? It's people sometimes are reluctant to assign emotions to animals, but that's nonsense, right? Animals have loads of emotions. Emotions are, if anything, emotions are the things we share with animals the most, because emotions are this sort of very basic, very simple reaction to the world around us. And if your comfortable state is to be in your pack and you find yourself not in your pack, you can expect to have negative emotions about that. And this is probably something that is expressed in communication. A wolf who becomes isolated from the pack will call, wanting to reestablish contact to rejoin their pack. They don't know where anyone else is. Howl and see who howls back. So yeah, that idea of a lonely howl is not just poetic. It's very, very likely a real thing, that a wolf, an isolated wolf who's become separated from the pack, who howls, is howling a lonely howl. That makes perfect sense. It's not anthropomorphic at all.
Do other animals get lonely and call out like that too?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, those animals that live in groups, that have to live in groups, almost all have that kind of long distance isolation call. Now, in fact, animals that live in groups often have a short range call called a contact call that they just make all the time. Right? They're just always making this call, and it's sort of like, "I'm here, I'm okay, I'm here, I'm okay." And when you have a group of, say, meerkats who do this really well, and they're always digging in the sand, looking for bugs to eat and stuff like that, often got their heads underground, right? And so there's predators around, there are other meerkats around, other meerkat groups around. So to keep in touch with each other, to make sure everything's okay, to make sure you know where everyone is really important. And they do this by sort of chattering all the time. They're almost talking to themselves, and the fact they can hear the others ones talking to themselves is reassuring. It means, like, yeah, the group's here. You've not got lost. Everyone's around. Everything's okay. That's pretty common.
Do you think there's things like mental illness in animals?
Well, I think that there are certainly states, emotional states of animals that are pathological. Mental states that are not conducive to the sort of the good functioning of the animal. Does that mean mental illness? I think that's kind of a question of definitions. But I think anyone who has a pet has seen that the pet can be happy or can be sad. And if a dog is sad all the time, one might choose to say, well, this is a pathological state. This is not the way that an animal should be. And to call that a mental illness, I think, is a reasonable description of what's going on. Certainly, if a human were sad all the time, you would say that's not the way that humans are supposed to be. There is a pathological state here. So I think there is a comparison there. But of course, the comparison it's not a direct one, because human mental health issues are so closely tied to our language, and again, our brains that are capable of understanding the concept of individuality. And that is a big difference with a lot of animals, such as dogs.
Wow, so yeah, so other animals don't really have this sense of individuality, I guess, but we do. I'm still trying to kind of extrapolate out the ramifications of that. What are the consequences of this individuality
Well, there's a there's a famous professor, Temple Grandin, who's written a number of books on this, and she's an autistic individual. She's very prolific in writing about animals and autism. And one of her ideas is that there's a great deal of similarity between autistic individuals, autistic humans, and some animals, and particularly the way they communicate. So one of the features of autism in humans is a sort of disconnect in that inter-individual comprehension. That idea that I can know what you're thinking, but what you're thinking is different from what I'm thinking. And and in autistic individuals, that ability is often reduced. Now, by comparison, we say that in fact, in most animals, that ability is reduced, if not absent completely. So there is a sort of comparison there that when a dog, for instance, is watching you, when your pet dog is watching you, and wants to go for walks or staring at you, with these eyes like looking at you like, I want to go for a walk, I want to go for a walk. They don't understand, they cannot understand that you have other things on your mind because they don't have that sense that I'm a different individual from you. So in that sense, that has some comparisons with the difficulties that autistic people face when talking to someone, and that other person has other ideas and other thoughts and other things in their mind, that it's not that easy to recognize what they are and what they're different from what you're thinking. So there are some very, very interesting comparisons there. Whether there are like mechanistic similarities, or whether we can say something about causes of autism, I don't know. But there's certainly some very interesting comparisons.
How did human language change as society and civilization kind of got more and more complex? This is a huge, huge question, but like, I guess I'm trying to imagine, was there a difference the way we communicated back when we were in these little tribes or whatever versus now?
Yeah, I think almost certainly, whatever the pathway, whatever that evolutionary pathway to language was amongst early humans, it certainly had nothing to do with technology, right? It was nothing to do with building spaceships or computers or anything like that. There was no real advantage to our ancestors on the savannah to be able to communicate complex ideas about how to build things, and design blueprints, and convey these kinds that was not the role of language back then. It is now. Now, one of the main features of language is that it's used to convey really, really complex ideas to enable us to do complex things like build spaceships. So, what probably happened is that the language that our ancestors had evolved for its own reasons, whatever they were, but it was a almost coincidentally gave this ability to convey complex ideas. So, whatever it was that drove the evolution of language created something that had an ability that was really exceptional, that ability to convey complex information. And long before history, long before things were written down, 4,000 years ago, humans were able to cooperate to build cities, buildings, structures, all kinds of things that they needed language. They needed that communication, complex communication of language to be able to cooperate and do. So clearly it was already being used long ago, it was being used for these complex technological tasks. But that's almost certainly not why it evolved in the first place.
Do you think now that we have technologies like this, we might change the way we communicate in the future? Like you're saying we communicate to the level and in the way that to fill our needs. If we start talking more like on the smartphones and with other technologies, could you imagine we start talking differently or something like that?
Yeah, we are not subject to the same sort of long-term adaptive pressures that animals that don't have language are subjected to. So, like I said, wolves evolve behaviors that optimize their fitness, their reproductive fitness. We're not in that position. It's not the individuals who have the most successful children that are the most successful. It's about other things that make success in human society. It's ideas that become successful, not people. Ideas spread through our society. Ideas are the things that seem to have an evolutionary behavior in themselves. Think about all the trends. Which is the social media platform that's most used? Think about technology in itself. The way that smartphones have completely taken over almost every human society on the planet. That's an evolutionary process, but it's not evolution of humans. It's an evolution of our ideas and the things that humans use. So, will we change? Will the way we communicate change in the future? Yeah. Will it change to optimize our communication? Probably not. It will change according to those very rapid processes by which ideas spread through a society.
This has got to be one of the hardest topics I've ever done. You're just like too smart. But it does bring up another topic, like different humans' variability in the language abilities of different people. Like, I say someone's academic, say someone's like just like a normal kind of guy living in his hometown, never really left, and maybe illiterate people, for example. It's interesting how there's all this variability in language abilities across even the human species, and why do some people have the need to develop more complex language, and others that just, like, literally don't, and they're both equally happy perhaps, and they're both, like, kind of surviving and doing their thing, and what's going on there?
Sure. But every human is born with the ability to use language just as well as every other human. This is something that is very fundamental to being human. Wherever you're born, whoever your parents are, you can be picked up and placed in a different country and you will learn the language of that country perfectly. Right? There's no sort of innate difference. There's something about humans that have that language ability built into us. And it's so powerful. We can learn any language from birth. Now, do some humans use language more than others? Of course they do. Some people need it more and some people need it less, but that's not because of a difference in ability. That's just a difference in practice and in how they use it. Can every human become a gymnast? Well, probably. I can't do it. That's not something that I've practiced since I was young. But I've not practiced been speaking Vietnamese since I was young either, so I don't do it very well. But that ability is there in every human, and this sort of superficial difference that we see, that some people use language a lot, politicians, orators, authors, academics, and other people have less of a need for it. Perhaps people who work more or less on their own, shepherds, perhaps a less need for a less complex language. That's merely a reflection of how we grow up and how we have been raised, and rather than being some difference in innate ability.
I notice there's times in my life, I think we all notice, where our language abilities, sort of fall apart. Say we're under stress, we're drunk, really sleepy. There's times when, even like right now, I feel like I'm less articulate than I usually am, maybe because I'm nervous because 'cause I'm talking to this, Cambridge professor, and I was looking forward to this conversation a lot, and now I find myself kind of bumbling, and why do people do this? Is it just a part of the brain is shutting down when we're nervous and under stress or whatever? Um, how can we make sure that we can keep our language abilities throughout, we could turn it on when we want it? Because right now, like, I wanna turn it back on, but I'm like, "Listen to me," you know?
I'm not a speech therapist or someone who's an expert on problems of human language, but I can tell you that one of the things that's going on here is that language is just a window into our thoughts. And the moment that your thoughts become overwhelmed, then it's not surprising that the language becomes overwhelmed as well, right? Here are our ideas as you said. I'm bombarding you with a whole load of ideas, and they are difficult and they are complicated, and they all seem to be in conflict with each other. For me, I talk about this a lot. I work with this a lot. So I could see the structure in my own thoughts, and so the language comes out quite easily. But the moment that your brain is working really hard to organize all those thoughts, then it's hardly surprising that the communication of those thoughts gets confused as well. Remember, language appears to have evolved a way of projecting our thoughts to other people. There seems to be something really fundamental about what human language is all about. So the moment our thoughts aren't in order, then it's hardly surprising that the projection of our thoughts aren't in order either.
Yeah, maybe like too much new information coming in at once. That kind of messes things up for for us and probably for a lot of animals. I guess it's, with humans, there's a lot more potential for a bombardment of information and of new information. But even for an animal, perhaps like you can imagine like all kinds of new things happening in the environment simultaneously, and they might just freeze up or something. Their communication could break down.
Yeah. So when you are listening to listening, let's talk about acoustic communication only. But when an animal's listening to what's happening in the environment, clearly there's a lot going on. There are the birds and the deer and probably a lot of human noises as well, which really confuse animals sometimes. But animals are really good at filtering those out and being able to focus in on the important things. And the reason for that is there are very few important things. Once again, it's this question of evolution for optimality. Those individuals who can filter out everything else and hear the tiger coming, they're the ones that are going to survive. And their children are going to have that same ability. So that ability is going to spread through the population. So animals don't have to worry about too much. Where's something I can eat and who might be coming to eat me? Two main things. So it's quite easy for them to filter out a lot of the other stuff that's going on. Humans have way, way more that they need to listen out to and interpret, and their interpretation of the environment is far, far more complex. So, that's one of the reasons why we have such big brains, but it's also a source of potential confusion. Can animals be confused? Sure, they can. And particularly, we see a lot of problems with animals that get confused when there's a lot of human noise in the environment, like road noise. Really, really, really can confuse animals because they've evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to pick up one thing, the sound of their predator coming to get them. And then when you change that sound environment, all of a sudden they can't do it. And it's not so easy for them to adapt. Going to be a lot of them are going to get eaten before the few that survive because they can filter out the human noises are the ones that become successful. Yeah, and that's a real problem. That's a real conservation problem at the moment.
Yeah, and it's also, like, challenging for people when we meet new people and we're talking to someone new for the first time, because it seems like we're doing multiple things. We're not just trying to get the information, we're also trying to figure out, "Who is this person? Are they my friend? What's my social standing?" There's all kinds of this kinda stuff going on, and I find that kind of distracting. I wanna be able to turn off the whole, like, non-information. It's all information, but, like, I just wanna, like, listen to what you're saying, but then, like, in the back of my head's like, "Oh, what do you think about me? Do I fit my self-image right now? How am I gonna sound?" And I wanna be able to turn that off, and I usually do, but sometimes when I find someone who I really, really like, or I want to impress, or I want to be able to keep up to their status, maybe you just can't, and that's sort of a sad thing, maybe because, you sense this status gap between people. You're like, "Oh," you start, whining like a wolf or something and communicating differently.
Well, I don't think it's a sad thing. Remember that our communication, our language evolved initially precisely for that. I mean, that is absolutely what you describe, absolutely fundamental to our communication. You see it today in chimpanzees. Their communication is largely about impressing others, figuring out what their status is relative to others, appeasing those who are more powerful, bullying those who are less powerful. It's such a fundamental part of our communication. I don't think it can be turned off. I think it is essential to how we talk. But we have a way out of that. We have a way out of that. And that is our non interpersonal communication. Books, radio shows, we have managed to disconnect the information from the social communication through writing and through technology. And so now when you read a book, right, when you read Harry Potter, you're not trying to impress J.K. Rowling, right? This is you're reading it and you're getting the information directly. That nice little disconnect there allows us to overcome that. But yeah, you're right. In interpersonal communication, I think it's just so fundamental. I don't think you can get away from it.
Yeah, it is a nice little hack though that we got these books and we got the internet and all these things to learn from. Yeah, I wonder what would it be like if animals could do that kind of thing. For animals, they must face each other to get the information from each other. I mean, I guess they could leave little marks here and there, but they don't really write or like dogs will sometimes like scratch the tree or pee on something, but that's like really simple. Like, what's that gonna? It's not gonna teach you like anatomy or geography or something.
I think that you're right that the vast majority of animal communication is really between individuals. So when a dog smells pee, it's trying to identify the individual. It's trying to identify the characteristics of that individual who left that scent mark. When wolves howl, we know that they can tell the difference between the howls of individual wolves. Dolphins have special whistles that identify them as individuals. There's a lot of individual identification going on. And so the idea that animals can communicate without knowing anything about the individuals pretty rare. It's actually pretty rare. And that's because individual information is really important to animals, right? The most obvious thing, like, are they bigger and stronger than me? Or smaller or weaker than me. That's a really important thing to know if you're going to interact with another individual. Have I interacted with them before? Do I trust them? Do I work well with them? Are they my friend? Are they my enemy? That information is pretty central to all social animals, and even with animals that don't live in large groups. Oftentimes, their communication is about advertising their strength. So you think of like deer, male deer roaring to each other, or lions roaring to each other, tigers marking their territory by roaring. This is all about this is me. I am strong. Don't come near me. So yeah, individual information is pretty central.
The source of information of the other individuals seems to be like this face to face, one on one thing. But one fascinating and kind of scary thing about human communication is we can talk about each other. There's things like gossip. We have a name and we might not ever meet this individual, but information about us will go towards them. And so this whole uh, friendship and trust and everything that is important to us, like the job and money and all these different things, are like we never know how far this information will travel. The traveling of information seems endless almost. It can travel across the world, and you don't, and the not knowing who knows about you is also like a wow. That's a wild thing that I don't know if other animals experience that.
It would be wonderful if we could find that kind of behavior in animals. We certainly haven't, and it's quite likely it doesn't exist because it may be very tied to language proper, like we have. Um, as I said, there are animals that have names for each other, dolphins, for instance, and we're pretty sure that dolphins use those names to identify what they think of other individuals, right? So, do I want to cooperate with this individual or not? That's almost like the first step towards gossip. Do dolphins gossip about each other? It would be fantastic to find some way to test that. I think it'd be really difficult, but I can't rule it out. I think it's unlikely, but I certainly can't rule that out. Dolphins live in quite complex interacting groups that are always shifting, and memberships of the groups are always shifting from one to another. They're often like compared to human gangs, gang membership. And then there are these negative interactions between the different groups. And so you can see that there could be some benefit in being able to say, oh no, don't let him into the group. I don't trust him. But no one's done that experiment. It would be really cool thing to look at.
How about like animal to human or species to species communication? This is like it's sort of a sci-fi dream and maybe a dog owner's dream too, or a lot of us. How possible is it for humans to communicate with animals? What are the limits and potentials of human to other species communication?
Well, we do. There's no doubt that we do. You gave the example of dog owners. You can communicate a lot with your dog. You can explain what you want. They can explain what they want to an extent. So there's already a lot of communication between humans and other species. How far can it go? That really depends on how much innate ability to convey information those animals have. So if those animals have the ability to communicate an unlimited number of concepts like we do, like if animals could talk about anything, then presumably it would be possible for humans to tap into that. The reality is, though, that they almost certainly don't. There are very, very few species that you would even suspect might have as rich a communication as we do as human language. Certainly not dogs. Certainly not wolves. It seems to be that animals don't need that complex communication. Now, of course, there are animals we know relatively little about their communication. Dolphins are the best example. We don't exactly understand what they use their communication for, but it would seem very unlikely that they have a language like ours. It would seem very unlikely because it wouldn't seem to give them any adaptive advantage. It wouldn't seem to give them the kind of advantages that they need. But it's something we just have to we have to keep on researching and keep on investigating. If animals don't have a language like us, right, like a really rich and full and infinite language, then you'll never be able to do a Google Translate on them. It won't work because there's no language to translate, right? But it doesn't mean we can't communicate with them. We clearly can communicate with dogs, with dolphins, with chimpanzees. All of those things work. Whether or not we'd be able to have a conversation like this with another species depends entirely on whether they have language. And my sense is that they don't.
I'm just wondering, like, since I imagine we have a lot of the same hardware down there in there that maybe we can kind of subtract some stuff and go down to their level. If we figure out this is how they communicate, we can like build some kind of technology. It won't be with words or something, and we can like somehow connect with each other on a deeper level. Because, like, right now, you have a dog and you're, like, speaking English or Japanese to it or something, it's cool. I guess you're making sound and you're communicating with your gestures and things, but I'm wondering, like, that can't be ideal. There must be, like, some way for us to, like the dog to feel more connected and loved and, for us to connect to that dog and maybe other species too. It might involve building certain technologies or something, or maybe just shutting up and acting more like a dog or acting more like a wolf or a monkey or something, but that kind of communication is what I'm talking about. It's like, "Whoa, that'd be cool to be, like, see each other in a safe way, I guess."
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. I think that when we communicate with our dogs, for instance, and as you say, we do it in our own language and we're expecting them to understand the language that we speak, and they do the best they can, which is often pretty impressive, but but clearly never quite enough. Um, you're right. The first thing you need to do is you need to get down on your hands and knees and observe how dogs actually behave and behave like a dog. I mean, don't literally mean get down on your hands and knees, but metaphorically, hoping to squeeze a dog into a sort of furry human body is never going to work very well. Uh, Observe how they behave, what their communications are, why are they communicating, when do they communicate, what are they trying to tell you, rather than putting on a high voice and trying to talk to them like a little baby. And I think there is a lot that we can do in that direction because, as I said, dogs are essentially social animals. They live in family packs just like we keep them in our houses. So there's really a lot of scope there for taking the way that the animal behaves, understanding it more, and using that to communicate better. Now, one of the things you have to do if you want to do that is to understand and to accept that animals, by and large, don't use words. They can learn words. They can learn what you mean by walkies or stop. That's something different. They don't actually use words. Animal communication is, by its nature, very fuzzy. They convey concepts, emotions particularly, and there can be a lot of subtlety in that transfer of emotions, but it's not word. There is no dog word for bone, right? It doesn't exist. And if you, as you mentioned, using technology, so we can, and people have tried this, use technology, for instance, to identify different kinds of barks, which barks are happy and which barks are angry, which barks are nervous. That kind of information, yes, 100%. I'm sure that information is there in the communication. I'm sure we can use technology to extract that, but it's got to start from that understanding of that's the way they're communicating. That's what they need to communicate, not words. It's not words.
Yeah, and you mentioned how humans, we each have a different sort of set of information. Like I have access to some information that you don't have, and everyone has different information just 'cause we're in different places and we've read different books and things. Do animals have access to some information that humans don't have access to? And would there be any way for us to get that information from them? Of course, in an ethical way, we're not gonna, like, extract the data from their brain and, like, hurt them or whatever, but, like, it I'm wondering, like, what can we learn from animals? What do they know that we don't know? And there must be, like, a big, wild universe in there of information that, like, we just don't have access to because of our senses and because of our language.
Sure, but it may also be that we're not capable of perceiving that information. Certainly, if the information is encoded in some sense that we are not particularly skilled at, smell, for instance, I'm sure dogs perceive the world of smell in a very, very rich way. A dog's sense of what the world around them is largely defined by the smells that they smell. And we're never going to be able to comprehend that. It doesn't matter what technology you use, there will always be this gap in that we don't have that connection to our sense of smell that dogs do physically, biologically. We're not wired that way. So a lot of that is not going to work very well. I mean, it'd be lovely. I'd love to have some sort of color map of the world based on the smells or something like that. But it'll never be quite like the dog perceives it. When it comes to specific information, the issue here once again is that most animals don't convey specific information to other animals because they don't understand that the other animal doesn't know that information. Now I say most, but not all. There are definitely species that can do that. And in those cases, I think there is quite a lot that we could learn. So dolphins, for instance, understand that there's information that they have that other individuals don't. So one could, in theory, ask a dolphin, what's at the bottom of the sea? Given the constraint that they don't have words, that answer is likely not to be quite as specific as we want it to be.
Oh, so they, like, kind of assume that what they know, everyone else already knows?
Well, I see. I wouldn't say they assume what they know is what everyone else knows because I think they haven't got that sense of self and other. Most animals, it never occurs to a dog that you might be a different dog from it. And the very famous experiment to do this is where it's been done a lot with chimpanzees to show that chimpanzees do have this ability. But you have a dog observing an animal observing a scene where you have two boxes, and experimenter comes and puts food in one of the boxes. Okay, and there's a second dog observing this as well, seeing the experimenter put the food in the box. Then a screen comes down and hides the second dog. First dog is still watching. The experimenter comes and moves the food to the other box, and the screen goes up. So now dog number one knows that the food has been moved. Dog number two doesn't know the food has been moved. And now the question is, does dog number one know that dog number two doesn't know? Because if you do this experiment with a young child, if you do this experiment with a severely autistic person, the assumption is that the other individual knows what you know. The dog will assume, the first dog will assume the second dog will go to the second box where the food really is because he saw it being moved. Second dog, of course, doesn't know the food's been moved. He goes straight to the first box. And then the first dog's like, whoa, why'd you go to the wrong box? Should have gone to that box. So there are these complex experiments that can be done to test whether an individual organism has that sense of another organism has different information from me. And most species don't have that ability.
It's so hard to even imagine what that perception is like. So how about the other species? Do they have this sense of I guess they also don't have a sense of this is another species.
Well, I mean, you can have a sense of another species. You can have a sense of another individual. As I said, many animals prefer certain individuals over others. Right? There'll be two dogs that get on well, and two dogs that don't get on well. That's fine. Identification of an individual is very common, very common, and actually very evolutionarily advantageous because some individuals are reliable, some individuals are not, some individuals are aggressive, some are friendly. So knowing remembering which individual is which is clearly an advantage. That's not the same as knowing what that individual is thinking or knowing that that individual is thinking. The fact that I can identify another individual doesn't mean that I identify their thoughts as being different from mine. It's a very big distinction.
It is a bit humbling though, or it's sad, but it's also kind of exciting to see that there's so much we can't know. Like before, you're talking about how there's certain sound frequencies or light frequencies or smells and things that I think we'd be tempted to be like, we can translate that. We can translate that smell into this. We can translate that thing into this visual thing on our computer. But it's like you're right. It's like the whole Mary's red or what's it like to be a bad type thing. Like you're just never gonna know. And God, that's quite frustrating because we want to know everything as humans, but there's things that we can't know. I guess.
Yep. Once you get into the minds of others, then yeah, there's certainly things that we can't know. Although, of course, we as humans have gone a very long way towards that because we actually can project our minds using language. And we're the only creatures that can do that. We can tell each other what we're thinking. And that's probably as close as we will ever get to mind reading. But it's pretty good, you know. It's not a bad step at all when you think about literature, when you think about emotions, when you think about emotional relationships, the fact that you can tell someone what you're thinking and they can tell you what they feel about you. This is a huge window into each other's minds that other animals just don't have.
Is there anything you think we lost by developing such complex communication by having language? Like, there's a certain way of what it feels like to probably be a bat or to be a dog, and there's a way it feels like to be like an intelligent human being versus being a child or something. Would there be any benefits to turning down the language? Of course, we want to crank it up and we want to build everything that allows us to do. But did we lose anything from this?
I mean, I'm not sure that's a productive way of thinking about things. Do we lose anything by not having wings to fly with? Yeah, you know, I'd love to be able to fly, but that's not who we are. And you ask about turning down language. I think that language is so fundamentally wired into who we are as humans that we can't get away from that. Of course, we can speak less. There are plenty of people who choose to be isolated and not communicate, and that's that's fine. That's one way of being human. But they will never get rid of that human ability or the human biological structure of being linguistic creatures. Even the most isolated Trappist monk will never ever lose that what it is to be human by having language.
You dedicated your book to your dog, Darwin. How did your studying wolves change the way you connected with him?
I think all of my experience in the field with wild animals, not just with wolves, but with animals in general. You know, a lot of what we do is about observation. It's about observing behaviors. And when you observe animals in the wild, you need to be really open. You need to open your eyes and see how they're behaving and why without imposing sort of ideas about human behavior on them. And when you do that, you see, you know, there are a lot of things. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of complexity that you see in the way that all animals behave, whether it's wolves, you know, or, gibbons in the jungle, or if it's just birds in your garden. And it really helps your relationship with your pets to sit down and observe without judgment, without imposing human ideas, and to start to notice the subtle many of the very subtle behaviors that reflect emotion, that reflect how an individual animal is feeling. And I really do think that for dog owners in particular, you know, to be able to perceive a lot of the things that we blank out often as humans, we just sort of ignore in 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 our pet animals' behaviors because they don't really fit into the human way of communicating. If you can open your eyes to those and without judgment, you know, without sort of preconceptions, to to see every little twitch of an ear or shift of a pose, they all convey some information, and so I think you can I think that generates a really deep connection between a human and an animal is that ability to see and accept those all those signals that are really subtle but very very important.
Yeah, I guess it also kinda clears up some of the miscommunication between humans and animals, humans and their pets too, right? Because we might also apply sort of human intentions onto them, like, "Why did you pee on the floor?" Or "Why did you" I don't know, it's like we do think they're intending things, but I guess they don't really intend things, do they?
Well, they have intentions and they are clearly going to be different from the intentions that we have. But yeah, I totally agree. I think that one of the big problems with dealing with problematic animal behavior or pet animal behavior is that we assume that when we communicate with another individual, we assume that they have a mind, they are thinking different things from us. We need to convey what we are thinking so that they will think what we want them to think. And that breaks down when an individual, an animal, doesn't have that sense of other. Um, you know, a dog cannot understand that you think something different from what it thinks. You know, when the dog, I don't know, eats some food is off the table, gets up on the kitchen counter and you know eats the food that you were preparing for dinner, and you're angry about that. That dog, you need to think of a subtle way of conveying that because a dog can't understand that you have a different perception of that food than it did. Can understand you're angry. That's something very evolutionarily obvious, but sharing the mental space is not something that they're very good at.
If people wanna learn more about animal communication, are there any kind of books or general kind of resources or whatever? Where do any kind of recommendations on where people can go to kinda start going down this path?
Yeah, well, there's my book, of course, and what I do in my book, which I did in my previous book as well, is like I do give a rather than giving references to publications and things. Each chapter I give a list of popularly accessible books that talk about these issues. So, for instance, if you're particularly interested in wolves, there's some really great books about wolf behavior and wolf communication. And you know, in Yellowstone National Park, where I work, there have been there's been a long running study of the wolf ecosystem there, and one of the scientists there, Rick McIntyre, has written a whole load of books about the behavior of the wolves in Yellowstone. It's great resource, absolutely fantastic resource. But they tend to be species specific. A lot of these books, about wolves or about dolphins or about parrots, um, and so there's some. I've got some pretty good resources in there. If you want to learn, if you're interested in parrots, then Irene Pepperberg has written a popular book about her work with Alex the parrot, for instance. There's some good stuff out there if you want to know about animal communication.
Yeah, and if you want like a sort of a book that kind of covers a bunch of these animals, you got parrots and chimpanzees, gibbons, dolphins, and hyraxes, and humans and others in your book. So that's a good one to start with. If there's one thing you want people to take away from your book that you're worried they might miss the main point, what sort of is the main point, the main message that you do want to get out through this book?
Yeah, and I do say it explicitly quite a lot in the book, but I think if you want to understand animals, you need to understand animals, not as very humans, not as what we want them to be, not as what we think they ought to be, but as what they evolved to be. Each animal species has evolved to fill a particular niche in our ecosystem, to behave in a particular way because it is advantageous to them. And it's that understanding of why animals have evolved to behave in a particular way. That's the way to understand who they are and what they are, is to understand the why of it. They're not humans. They don't need to be like humans. They don't need to have what we have or the abilities that we have. They are what they are, and that's the way it should be.
And if people want to connect with you, yeah, they can get your book. That's one way to connect with you without actually connecting with you. But what are some other ways they can get a little closer?
Well, there's a lot of podcasts around, and a couple of TV episodes and stuff like that. And Google's a good resource. Just Google me.
Thank you so much, and yeah, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for all of your time today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me along.